April 12, 1945. A muddy lane somewhere in Lincolnshire. 23-year-old Oberstreiter Klaus Hartmann stood in the back of a British Army lorry, hands gripping the wooden side rails as the vehicle bounced over ruts left by spring rains. Around him sat 11 other German prisoners, all captured during the final Allied push across the Rhine into Germany's heartland just weeks earlier. They had been processed through camps, classified, issued worn civilian work clothes to replace their Wehrmacht uniforms, and told they would be working on British farms for the duration of their captivity. Nazi propaganda had filled their minds with images of what awaited: brutal forced labor under sadistic guards, starvation rations, perhaps being worked literally to death as revenge for the Blitz. Hartmann had whispered prayers during the journey, committing his soul to God before whatever horrors began. The lorry turned off the main road onto an even narrower track, passing between hedgerows just beginning to show spring green. It stopped at a farmyard gate where a man in his 60s stood waiting, cap in weathered hands, face lined by decades of sun and wind and worry. The British guard who had accompanied them from the processing center jumped down from the cab and exchanged words with the farmer in English too rapid for Hartmann to follow despite the basic phrases he had learned. The farmer nodded, stepped forward, and looked directly at Hartmann with eyes that held not hatred but something Hartmann could not quite identify. Caution mixed with curiosity, perhaps, and something that might have been sympathy. The guard gestured for Hartmann and 2 other prisoners to dismount. "You 3 will work here," he said in halting German learned from a phrase book. "Mr. Thompson is your farmer. You will obey him. You will work hard. You will not try to escape. If you cause trouble, you will be sent to worse places." The guard's tone suggested this was routine speech he had delivered dozens of times. Mr. Thompson extended his hand toward Hartmann, not aggressively, not threateningly, but in the universal gesture of greeting between men. Hartmann stared at the offered hand for a long moment, unable to reconcile this simple courtesy with everything he had been taught to expect. His Nazi indoctrination had not prepared him for this. Slowly, still uncertain whether this was some kind of trap or test, he reached out and shook the British farmer's hand. The grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who had worked soil all his life. Mr. Thompson nodded, released Hartmann's hand, and spoke a single English word Hartmann recognized: "Welcome." This scene, repeated thousands of times across Britain from 1944 through 1948, marked the beginning of one of World War II's most unexpected stories. A transformation so complete that it would end not merely in reconciliation but in marriage, family, and permanent bonds between former enemies who had every historical and personal reason to remain forever separate. By the time the last German prisoners were repatriated in July 1948, Britain would have hosted 400,000 German captives, deployed 180,000 of them to agricultural labor that represented up to 25% of the nation's entire farm workforce, witnessed at least 796 documented marriages between German prisoners and British women in the immediate aftermath of policy changes, seen 25,000 to 32,000 former prisoners choose to remain permanently in Britain rather than return to devastated Germany, and fundamentally changed both British rural communities and individual German lives in ways that would echo through generations. The story began not with love, but with desperate practical necessity, evolved through daily proximity and shared labor into something approaching respect, was transformed by acts of generosity and courage into genuine friendship, and culminated for some in romances that defied both propaganda and public opinion to create families that bridged the deepest divides of the 20th century's most destructive conflict. To understand why German prisoners ended up on British farms requires understanding Britain's desperate agricultural labor crisis that threatened food production at the exact moment when the nation needed maximum output to feed both its military forces and civilian population while maintaining exports to allied nations. British agriculture had always relied heavily on young male laborers, but the war had conscripted millions of men into military service, leaving farms critically understaffed. The Women's Land Army, established in 1939 to fill this gap, mobilized 80,000 British women to work on farms performing tasks traditionally done by men: plowing, harvesting, animal husbandry, all the demanding physical labor of agricultural production. These land girls, as they became known, made heroic contributions maintaining British food production throughout the war, but they could not fully compensate for the sheer numbers of men who had left farming for military service. By 1943, with the war clearly turning in the Allies' favor but victory still requiring years of sustained effort, British agricultural planners faced grim calculations about whether domestic food production could be maintained at levels necessary to prevent rationing from becoming outright hunger. The solution, proposed initially by the Ministry of Agriculture and debated extensively in Parliament, was to deploy prisoners of war to agricultural labor. This proposal generated considerable controversy. Many British civilians whose homes had been bombed, whose relatives had been killed by German military action, whose lives had been upended by years of war, reacted with outrage to suggestions that German prisoners should be allowed to work British land and potentially interact with British communities. The emotional argument that Germany deserved no consideration, that German prisoners should be confined to maximum security camps and given minimal resources, had powerful appeal to a population that had suffered terribly. But practical necessity and international law ultimately prevailed over emotional objections. The 1929 Geneva Convention permitted belligerent powers to require prisoner of war labor with certain restrictions. Work could not be dangerous, could not directly support the captor's war effort, and must be compensated. Agricultural labor met these criteria. It was necessary for national survival, it did not directly aid military operations, and it could be structured to comply with Geneva Convention requirements. Parliament authorized prisoner deployment to farms despite public skepticism and opposition. The initial deployment was cautious and limited. In March 1945, approximately 70,000 German prisoners worked in various capacities throughout Britain, though not all in agriculture. By VE Day on May 8, 1945, roughly 70,000 worked specifically in agricultural roles. But the numbers grew dramatically after Germany's surrender eliminated security concerns about prisoners escaping to rejoin military forces. With the war in Europe ended, restrictions on prisoner movement could be relaxed and deployment expanded. By mid-1946, 163,000 of the 338,000 total German prisoners held in Britain worked in agriculture. By September 1946, the peak prisoner population period, Britain held 402,200 German prisoners. Many transferred from camps in the United States and Belgium as those nations closed their prisoner facilities. Throughout 1946, German prisoners performed a fifth of all agricultural work in the United Kingdom. By 1947, this had increased to 25% of the total land workforce. 1/4 of all farm labor in Britain was being performed by German prisoners of war. These prisoners were not housed in central camps and transported daily to farms under heavy guard. Instead, they were billeted directly on the farms where they worked, living in converted barns, outbuildings, or small cottages on farm properties, often with minimal supervision, especially after VE Day eliminated concerns about prisoners attempting to return to military service. A farmer might have 2 to 6 German prisoners living on his property, working alongside British farmhands if any remained, land army women, and the farmer's own family. The proximity was intimate and unavoidable. Prisoners and British civilians worked the same fields, operated the same equipment, ate meals at the same times if not always the same tables, shared the same daily rhythms of agricultural life dictated by seasons, weather, and the needs of crops and livestock. This enforced proximity created opportunities for human connection that would have been impossible in conventional prisoner of war camps where security protocols maintained clear separation between captors and captives. The daily work routines were demanding but not brutal. German prisoners performed the full range of agricultural labor, plowing fields in spring, planting crops, maintaining irrigation and drainage systems, caring for livestock, harvesting crops from early summer through autumn, maintaining equipment and buildings, processing harvests for storage or market. The work was physically exhausting, requiring strength, endurance, and long hours during peak seasons like harvest, when weather windows were narrow and crops needed gathering before rains damaged them. But it was honest labor producing food rather than meaningless make-work designed merely to occupy prisoners' time, and most German prisoners recognized this distinction. Many had farming backgrounds themselves. Germany remained a substantially agricultural society in 1939 and brought genuine expertise to British farms. They understood crop rotation, animal husbandry, machinery maintenance. British farmers, initially skeptical about whether German prisoners would work effectively or whether cultural and language differences would create impossible friction, were often pleasantly surprised by the competence, and work ethic their German workers demonstrated. Language barriers created challenges that were overcome through a combination of necessity, patience, and improvisation. Few German prisoners spoke English fluently, and few British farmers spoke any German beyond basic commands learned from phrasebooks distributed by authorities. Communication in the early days relied on gestures, demonstrations, and simple words repeated until understood. British farmers showed prisoners how they wanted tasks performed rather than explaining verbally. Prisoners learned English agricultural vocabulary through immersion, the words for tools, crops, animals, weather conditions, the dozens of specific terms that farming requires. British civilians learned a handful of useful German phrases. Over weeks and months, a working pidgin developed that allowed basic communication about immediate tasks, though deeper conversations remained difficult until prisoners' English improved substantially. But communication transcended language through shared labor itself. When you work alongside someone day after day, when you struggle together to bring harvest in before approaching storms, when you share the satisfaction of successful lambing season, when you repair broken equipment together through trial and error, you develop understanding that does not require fluent verbal communication. Farmers learned which prisoners were reliable and which required more supervision. Prisoners learned which British farmhands and family members were fair-minded and which were prone to petty cruelties born of prejudice. Professional respect developed based on demonstrated competence rather than national identity. A British farmer who had initially viewed his German workers as enemy combatants deserving no consideration might grudgingly acknowledge after months of shared labor that young Klaus really did know how to repair tractor engines, that Werner had remarkable skill with livestock, that Hans worked harder than some British farmhands the farmer had employed before the war. The initial skepticism and hostility British farmers felt toward their German workers was natural and predictable given recent history. These farmers had listened to radio broadcasts of German bombing raids on British cities. They had seen newsreels showing destruction in London, Coventry, and other urban centers. Many had relatives in military service who had been killed or wounded fighting Germans. Their communities had suffered losses and hardships directly attributable to German aggression. When authorities first informed farmers they would be receiving German prisoner workers, many reacted with anger or at minimum deep reservation. They accepted the workers only because they desperately needed labor and had no alternative sources. They expected surly, uncooperative prisoners who would work minimally, cause problems, perhaps engage in sabotage, and require constant supervision. Some farmers treated their German workers with deliberate coldness in the early days, maintaining maximum social distance, refusing any interaction beyond necessary work instructions, making clear through tone and demeanor that the prisoners were tolerated only because economic necessity demanded it. But sustained proximity and shared labor gradually eroded this hostility through accumulated small interactions that humanized both sides to each other. A German prisoner who noticed a gate left open and took initiative to close it before livestock escaped demonstrated responsibility that earned acknowledgement. A British farmer who provided medical attention when a prisoner suffered a minor injury, disinfecting a cut, bandaging a sprain, demonstrated basic decency that challenged prisoners' expectations of British brutality. Shared meals, even when initially conducted in silence or with minimal conversation, created domestic intimacy that was difficult to reconcile with viewing each other as pure enemies. A British farmer's wife who prepared food for German workers as well as British farmhands, who ensured everyone received adequate portions despite rationing, who treated all workers with basic courtesy regardless of nationality, demonstrated values that contradicted Nazi propaganda about British barbarism. Professional respect developed as British farmers recognized that many German prisoners possessed agricultural skills equal to or exceeding those of British farmhands. Germany's agricultural traditions were sophisticated, and German prisoners who had grown up on farms brought knowledge of techniques and practices that sometimes improved British operations. Farmers who had initially viewed their German workers as merely adequate manual laborers capable only of following simple instructions discovered they had skilled agriculturalists who could diagnose livestock health problems, suggest improvements to planting schedules, repair complex machinery, and apply scientific understanding to practical farming challenges. This professional competence commanded respect that transcended national hostility. A farmer might still hate Germany and German military aggression while acknowledging that Klaus was genuinely talented with machinery or that Werner understood animal behavior remarkably well. The Women's Land Army added another dimension to prisoner-civilian interactions on British farms. Land Army women worked alongside German prisoners performing the same demanding physical labor, and the dynamic created by this proximity was complex and sometimes controversial. British society in the 1940s held traditional gender expectations about appropriate work for women and appropriate social interactions between women and men, particularly unmarried women and foreign men. The sight of British women working in fields alongside German prisoners, necessarily interacting throughout long workdays, speaking together, sometimes laughing at shared jokes or moments of absurdity in farm life's daily routine, troubled some observers who worried about fraternization and its potential consequences. Military authorities and farm supervisors were instructed to maintain proper separation and decorum, but the practical realities of farm work made strict segregation impossible. When harvest weather required maximum effort from all available workers, everyone worked together regardless of nationality or gender. When equipment broke and needed immediate repair, whoever had relevant skills worked on the problem together. Land Army women's perspectives on German prisoners varied widely based on individual temperament, personal war experiences, and specific interactions. Some maintained strict emotional distance, viewing the Germans as enemy combatants who deserved no friendliness regardless of current circumstances. These women performed their duties alongside prisoners but never softened into casual conversation or acknowledgement beyond work necessity. Other Land Army women, particularly those without close relatives killed or wounded in the war, allowed themselves to see the German prisoners as individuals rather than merely representatives of enemy nation. They noticed that Klaus talked about his mother's cooking with obvious homesickness, that Werner showed remarkable gentleness with animals, that Hans had a self-deprecating humor that transcended language barriers. They recognized that these young men were conscripts who had not chosen war but had been swept into it by forces beyond their control, and this recognition created possibility for human connection that transcended national divisions. Food sharing became one of the most powerful symbols of British civilians' gradual shift from hostility to acceptance toward German prisoners working on their farms. Britain operated under strict rationing throughout the war and for years afterward, with civilians limited to amounts of meat, sugar, tea, butter, cheese, and other staples that were far below pre-war consumption levels. Farming families generally had somewhat better access to food than urban families because they could grow vegetables, keep chickens for eggs, and occasionally slaughter livestock for meat, but even farming families experienced genuine scarcity and carefully managed their resources. In this context of universal scarcity, the decision to share food with German prisoners represented significant sacrifice. British farming families who provided extra portions to German workers, who invited prisoners to share family meals, who ensured German workers received adequate nutrition even when it meant British family members received less, demonstrated generosity that could not be attributed to strategic calculation or mere compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. These acts of generosity were noticed and remembered by German prisoners who had been taught that the British were selfish, weak, and would treat German captives with deliberate cruelty. A British farmer's wife who provided homemade bread to German workers when bread was strictly rationed, who offered cups of real tea rather than the thin substitutes many British civilians endured, who prepared meals that ensured prisoners received adequate calories for the demanding physical labor they performed, challenged every assumption prisoners had absorbed from Nazi propaganda. Some prisoners initially suspected these acts were manipulation tactics designed to extract cooperation or information, but sustained generosity over months convinced even skeptical prisoners that they were experiencing genuine human kindness from people who had every reason to be cruel. Letters prisoners wrote home to Germany, when mail service allowed, sometimes mentioned with wonder that British civilians shared their own scarce food with German prisoners. The winter of 1946 to 1947 tested everyone's endurance and became a period when relationships between British civilians and German prisoners either fractured under stress or solidified into something approaching genuine friendship through shared struggle. Britain experienced one of its harshest winters on record, with heavy snow beginning in late January and continuing through March, blocking roads, disrupting rail transport, isolating rural communities, and creating agricultural emergencies as livestock required feeding and watering under brutal conditions. German prisoners and British civilians worked together clearing snow, breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring animals survived, maintaining essential operations despite weather that made every task exponentially more difficult. When you have worked all day in freezing conditions alongside someone, when you have shared the exhaustion and small triumphs of getting necessary work done against all odds, when you have huddled together for warmth in a barn while a blizzard rages outside, you develop bonds that transcend the abstractions of nationalism and war guilt. The winter created shared hardship that built solidarity among all who endured it together. Christmas 1946 marked a deliberate turning point in British policy toward German prisoners and represented the moment when official restrictions began catching up with the de facto relationships that had already developed on many farms. From Christmas 1946 forward, German prisoners were allowed for the first time to visit British homes, to participate in holiday celebrations with British families, to experience British domestic life beyond the purely functional contexts of work and camp routine. This policy change was controversial and generated public debate about whether it was appropriate to celebrate Christian holidays with enemies who had killed British soldiers and bombed British cities. But the policy proceeded with support from church leaders who argued that Christian reconciliation required extending hospitality even to former enemies, from farmers who had come to know their German workers as individuals and wanted to include them in family celebrations, and from pragmatic administrators who recognized that German prisoners would be returning home eventually, and that positive experiences of British life might influence Germany's post-war trajectory toward democracy. The Christmas invitations varied enormously in their emotional tone and level of genuine warmth. Some British families invited German prisoners to Christmas dinner out of religious duty or social obligation, maintaining polite but cool distance throughout the meal, ensuring the gesture was performed but not encouraging deeper connection. Other families, particularly farming families who had worked alongside their German workers for months and had developed real fondness for specific individuals, welcomed prisoners into their homes with genuine warmth that treated them as honored guests rather than barely tolerated outsiders. One prisoner wrote to a local newspaper after Christmas 1946 expressing his astonishment and gratitude. "In no way was I prepared for what was done for me during Christmas Day by the family. I was like a dear part of it." This quote, preserved in historical records, captures the profound emotional impact these invitations had on prisoners who had been told to expect hatred and experienced instead acceptance into the most intimate space of British life, the family home during the most important holiday of the Christian calendar. For some British families, inviting German prisoners to Christmas dinner represented conscious acts of reconciliation and forgiveness that required confronting their own grief and anger about losses suffered during the war. Families who had lost sons or brothers to German military action, who had legitimate reasons to hate Germans collectively, made deliberate choices to separate the individual young men working on their farms from the abstract enemy that had caused so much suffering. A mother who invited a German prisoner to Christmas dinner despite having lost her own son in Normandy was performing an act of moral courage that transcended the understandable desire for revenge or at minimum emotional distance. These acts of deliberate generosity demonstrated that ordinary British civilians were capable of extraordinary grace under circumstances that would have justified bitterness. The Christmas 1946 celebrations opened doors that could not be easily closed afterward. Once German prisoners had sat at British family tables, shared holiday meals, participated in gift exchanges, sung Christmas carols together, seen photographs of British families' loved ones displayed on mantelpieces, heard stories about British family histories and traditions, the psychological distance between captor and captive had been breached in ways that transformed subsequent interactions. Prisoners who had been invited into British homes could no longer be viewed or treated as merely enemy combatants deserving minimal consideration. They had become individuals with names, personalities, stories, connections to specific British families. British families who had welcomed prisoners into their homes had invested emotional energy in those relationships and could no longer view their German workers as merely convenient labor. The human connections created during Christmas 1946 established foundations for relationships that would deepen through the following months and would, for some participants, transform into romances that led to marriage. The evolution from professional working relationships to personal friendships to romantic attachments happened gradually and varied enormously by individual circumstances, but certain patterns emerged across hundreds of documented cases. Young German prisoners, many in their early 20s, found themselves working alongside young British women from farming families or land army workers of similar ages. They shared daily labor, faced common challenges, developed inside jokes and shared references from their work experiences, noticed each other's qualities and attractive characteristics through sustained proximity. The German prisoners were far from home, lonely, uncertain about their futures, and the warmth of British families who showed them kindness had profound emotional impact. The British women encountered young men who were, stripped of uniforms and propaganda, simply young men. Some kind, some funny, some thoughtful, some possessing qualities that made them attractive as potential romantic partners regardless of nationality. The British government initially prohibited romantic relationships between British women and German prisoners, and marriage was explicitly forbidden under regulations designed to prevent fraternization from undermining public morale and creating diplomatic complications. These prohibitions reflected both practical concerns about the complexities of international marriages involving enemy nationals and moral panic about British women forming attachments to men who had recently been trying to kill British soldiers. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some British civilians believed any British woman who became romantically involved with a German prisoner was betraying her nation and dishonoring British servicemen who had died fighting Germans. Other British civilians took more nuanced views, recognizing that emotional attachments formed despite political circumstances and that love could not be easily controlled by military regulations. The prohibition policy created a situation where couples who developed genuine romantic feelings faced difficult choices about whether to pursue relationships secretly despite official prohibition and potential social consequences. Some couples defied the prohibition and conducted secret relationships with varying degrees of discretion. Clandestine meetings in barns or fields after work hours, notes passed when supervisors were not watching, stolen moments of privacy during chaotic harvest periods when everyone was too busy and exhausted to maintain careful surveillance. These secret relationships required courage from both partners because discovery could result in serious consequences. German prisoners could be transferred to more restrictive camps. British women could face social ostracism from communities that viewed their behavior as scandalous and unpatriotic. The secrecy added romantic intensity to relationships while also creating genuine fear about exposure. Some British families who noticed their daughters forming attachments to German workers reacted with fury and forbade contact beyond necessary work interactions. Other families took pragmatic approaches, neither encouraging nor explicitly forbidding relationships while hoping the situation would resolve itself when prisoners were eventually repatriated. In July 1947, more than 2 years after VE Day, the British government lifted the prohibition on marriages between British women and German prisoners. This policy change reflected evolving attitudes as the immediate post-war period gave way to early Cold War dynamics that began casting Germany as potential ally against Soviet expansion rather than permanent enemy deserving continued punishment. It also reflected pragmatic recognition that prohibitions had not prevented romantic attachments from forming, and that many prisoners would be remaining in Britain as civilian workers under the European Volunteer Worker Scheme rather than being immediately repatriated. The policy change opened floodgates that had been holding back relationships constrained by official prohibition. In the immediate aftermath of the July 1947 policy change, 796 marriages between German prisoners and British women were recorded, couples who had been waiting for legal permission to formalize relationships that had already formed. Many more marriages would follow in subsequent months and years, though precise statistics beyond the initial 796 become unclear in historical records. These marriages generated intense social controversy that made life difficult for many couples despite legal authorization. British communities divided sharply over whether these marriages were acceptable or scandalous. Some British women who married German prisoners faced ostracism from neighbors who refused to speak to them, threats from anonymous letter writers who called them traitors, exclusion from social activities and church groups where they had previously participated. Some British families disowned daughters who married Germans, refusing to attend weddings or acknowledge their daughters' husbands and children. The hostility was real, sustained, and sometimes violent. Documented cases exist of British women receiving death threats for marrying German prisoners, of mixed couples being physically assaulted by angry crowds, of businesses refusing to serve German men married to British women. The courage required for British women to marry German prisoners despite this social pressure was considerable, representing triumph of personal conviction over community opinion. The specific stories of individual couples demonstrate the human dimensions behind the statistics. One documented case involved a British Land Army woman who met a German prisoner while they both worked on a farm in the Midlands during 1945. They developed friendship through shared labor, discovered mutual interests and compatible temperaments, and gradually fell in love despite language barriers and the prohibition on fraternization. When the marriage ban was lifted in 1947, they married in a small church ceremony attended only by immediate family members because broader community opinion remained hostile. The couple remained in Britain, where the former prisoner transitioned to civilian employment on the same farm where they had met, eventually purchasing their own small farm and raising 3 children who grew up British with German heritage. This pattern repeated across hundreds of cases, German prisoners who had come to Britain as captives integrating permanently into British rural communities through marriages that created lasting bonds. Another documented case involved a farmer's daughter who fell in love with a German prisoner working on her family's farm despite her father's strong objections. Her father had served in World War I and carried deep hostility toward Germans based on his experiences in the trenches. He forbade his daughter from having any personal interaction with the German workers beyond necessary communication about farm tasks. But sustained proximity over months as they worked the same land created inevitable connection. The relationship developed despite prohibition, conducted through stolen moments and secret meetings, until the daughter confronted her father and insisted she was going to marry the German prisoner with or without parental approval. The father eventually gave reluctant consent, recognizing that his daughter's determination was unshakable and that complete estrangement from his daughter was worse alternative than accepting a son-in-law he had not wanted. The wedding was tense, with the father barely speaking throughout the ceremony, but over subsequent years as grandchildren were born and the German son-in-law proved himself to be devoted husband and competent farmer, the father's hostility gradually softened into grudging acceptance and eventually something approaching affection. Not all mixed marriages succeeded. Divorce rates among these couples were reportedly higher than average for British marriages of that era, reflecting the genuine challenges of cross-cultural relationships complicated by recent war trauma, language barriers, social isolation from disapproving communities, and economic hardships of post-war Britain. But many marriages endured and thrived, producing children who represented living symbols of reconciliation between nations that had been mortal enemies just years earlier. These children grew up navigating dual heritage, often bilingual in English and German, connected to family networks in both Britain and Germany, embodying possibility of peace and integration that their parents' generation had achieved through courage and love. The pay controversy surrounding German prisoner labor created tensions that complicated relationships between prisoners and British farm workers who feared economic exploitation by farmers using cheap prisoner labor instead of hiring British workers at fair wages. German prisoners working on British farms received only 1 shilling per day, equivalent to 5 pence in modern decimal currency, though direct monetary comparisons across decades obscure the real purchasing power. British authorities designated this payment as pocket money rather than proper wages, arguing that Germany's government should pay arrears when prisoners were repatriated. This interpretation was legally questionable under Geneva Convention provisions requiring detaining powers to ensure appropriate compensation for prisoner labor when prisoners worked for private individuals rather than state enterprises. British farm workers and labor unions protested that German prisoner labor at such low rates undercut British workers' wages and job prospects, creating incentive for farmers to prefer prisoner labor over hiring British workers at higher wages. The controversy reflected genuine economic tensions in post-war Britain where employment, wages, and labor rights were contentious political issues as the nation attempted to reconstruct its economy after years of wartime disruption. Some British farm workers resented German prisoners not because of nationality but because prisoners represented cheap labor that threatened their livelihoods. Farmers caught in the middle argued that they needed prisoner labor because insufficient British workers were available at any wage, that the choice was not between hiring prisoners cheaply or hiring British workers expensively, but between using prisoner labor or leaving crops unharvested and livestock untended. The debate continued through 1946 and 1947 until prisoner repatriation began reducing the number of German workers available and economic recovery eventually increased employment opportunities that made farm labor less desperate necessity for British workers. For German prisoners, the low pay was frustrating but not necessarily their primary concern. Most understood that proper wages would be paid eventually through some kind of post-war settlement mechanism, and in immediate terms they had basic needs for food and shelter met through their farm billets and camp provisions. The 1 shilling daily pocket money allowed them to purchase small personal items, cigarettes, writing materials, and other sundries that made life more bearable. Many prisoners sent portions of their modest earnings home to families in Germany who were experiencing far worse economic hardships in the chaotic post-war period when German currency had collapsed, food was scarce, and millions of displaced persons strained resources. The ability to send any money at all to family members back in Germany, even tiny amounts, provided prisoners psychological comfort that they were contributing to their family's survival rather than merely being absent burdens. The transition from prisoner of war status to civilian worker status complicated these economic relationships further. As repatriation began in earnest from late 1946 onward, many German prisoners chose to apply for European volunteer worker status that would allow them to remain in Britain as civilian employees rather than being repatriated to Germany. The motivations varied. Some had formed romantic relationships with British women and wanted to remain near partners. Some feared returning to Soviet-occupied zones where they might face harsh treatment. Some simply recognized that employment prospects and living conditions were better in Britain than in devastated Germany where housing was scarce and food shortages were severe. By late 1948, roughly 32,000 former prisoners had chosen to remain in Britain voluntarily under this civilian worker scheme, with roughly 25,000 documented as staying permanently rather than eventually returning to Germany. These men who chose to stay became permanent residents of British communities, particularly rural farming communities where they had worked as prisoners. They transitioned from captured enemies to civilian employees to eventually naturalized British citizens in some cases. They married British women at much higher rates than the general population of foreign workers because they had spent years living in close proximity to British families and had formed relationships that would have been impossible for new immigrants arriving without that sustained contact. Their children attended British schools, learned British customs, identified as British while maintaining connections to German heritage through fathers' stories and occasional visits to Germany to meet German relatives. The former prisoners who stayed became living bridges between Britain and Germany, personal embodiments of reconciliation that transcended official diplomatic relations. Regional variations in how different British communities received German prisoners reflected local cultures, war experiences, and leadership from influential community figures. Some rural communities, particularly in areas that had not experienced direct bombing or that had strong religious leadership emphasizing forgiveness and reconciliation, were relatively welcoming toward German workers from early in the deployment. Other communities, especially those near cities that had been heavily bombed or that had suffered high casualty rates among local military units, remained hostile much longer and maintained social distance from German prisoners even after marriages began occurring. Yorkshire farming communities developed particularly notable relationships with German workers, with some villages eventually erecting memorials acknowledging contributions German prisoners had made to local agriculture during critical years. Scottish farming communities in regions like Aberdeenshire similarly integrated German workers into local life, though not without initial resistance and ongoing tensions. The post-war correspondence between former prisoners and British families who had housed and worked with them provides poignant evidence of genuine bonds that had formed. Letters preserved in local archives and family collections show German men writing to British farming families years, or even decades after repatriation, maintaining friendships through correspondence that continued until deaths separated the correspondence. Former prisoners wrote about their lives in reconstructed Germany, shared news about marriages and children, expressed ongoing gratitude for treatment they had received during captivity that contradicted everything they had expected. British families responded with news from their own lives, updates about farm operations, inquiries about the welfare of Germans they had come to care about. Some former prisoners made return visits to Britain specifically to visit farming families who had shown them kindness, bringing their wives and children to meet the British families who had played such significant roles in their lives. These return visits, documented in local newspapers and family photographs from the 1960s through 1990s, represented remarkable personal reconciliation. Former prisoners who had worked British fields as captives returning as free men to visit as guests and friends, walking the same land they had worked decades earlier but now as welcome visitors rather than confined laborers. British families, often now elderly or represented by second generations who had grown up hearing stories about the German prisoners who had worked their parents' farms, welcomed these return visits as opportunities to reconnect with people who had shared important experiences during difficult times. The visits demonstrated that the connections formed during those years had been genuine and lasting, not merely temporary accommodation to necessity that dissolved once prisoners departed. The 25,000 German prisoners who chose to remain permanently in Britain rather than return to Germany represented the ultimate validation of British treatment and the authentic nature of relationships formed during captivity. These men made deliberate choices to build lives in Britain despite the multiple challenges such decisions entailed: separation from German families and friends, integration into British society where they would always carry some stigma as former enemies, economic uncertainties of starting civilian lives in foreign nation. The fact that so many thousands made this choice demonstrates that British treatment had been fundamentally different from their propaganda-driven expectations, and that relationships formed with British families and communities had become more important than returns to homeland. The children born to British-German marriages became inheritors of complex legacies. They grew up as British citizens with German heritage at a time when World War II memories were fresh and negative stereotypes about Germans remained prevalent in British culture. Some faced bullying at school or social discrimination based on their father's origins. But they also inherited the positive aspects of their parents' courage, the knowledge that their very existences resulted from love that had transcended war and propaganda, that their parents had chosen each other despite every obstacle society placed in their paths. Many of these children became advocates for reconciliation and international understanding as adults, using their personal stories to challenge simplified narratives about inevitable enmity between nations. The agricultural contribution German prisoners made to Britain during critical years when food production was essential for national recovery has been acknowledged by historians and agricultural economists even when it remains underappreciated in popular historical memory. The 180,000 German prisoners who worked British farms during 1946 to 1947, performing 20 to 25% of all agricultural labor, kept Britain fed during transition from wartime to peacetime economy. Without this labor force, British agriculture would have faced catastrophic shortfalls that would have required even harsher rationing than actually occurred and would have strained Britain's economic recovery. The prisoners planted and harvested crops, tended livestock, maintained infrastructure, and performed essential work that allowed British agriculture to function during years when British men were slowly demobilizing from military service and transitioning back to civilian employment. The economic value of this labor has been calculated by economists studying post-war British recovery, though exact figures vary depending on methodology. Conservative estimates suggest German prisoner labor contributed tens of millions of pounds to British agricultural output during the critical 1945 to 1948 period, using contemporary currency values that equate to hundreds of millions in modern terms. Beyond quantifiable economic value, prisoners provided intangible benefits by maintaining farm operations, preventing agricultural knowledge and infrastructure from degrading during transition years, and training British workers who eventually replaced them. The fact that farmers consistently praised German prisoner workers' competence and work ethic, that many farmers attempted to retain specific German workers when repatriation began, demonstrates that prisoners provided genuine value beyond merely being available bodies for labor. The marriages between British women and German prisoners represented social revolution that challenged prevailing attitudes about nationality, loyalty, and acceptable relationships. In 1940s Britain, national identity was strongly defined in opposition to Germany, and the idea that British women would choose German men as romantic partners seemed almost incomprehensible to many Britons who viewed nationality as defining essence rather than incidental characteristic. The women who married German prisoners were often accused of betraying their nation, dishonoring British servicemen who had died fighting Germans, and displaying moral weakness or poor judgment. These accusations reflected deeply held beliefs that relationships should be contained within national boundaries, and that crossing those boundaries during wartime or immediately post-war represented fundamental disloyalty. But the women who made these choices were exercising agency and rejecting the notion that their romantic lives should be dictated by political considerations. They had met specific individual men, had come to know those men through sustained personal interaction, had formed emotional attachments based on personal compatibility rather than national stereotypes, and had decided that their individual happiness and authentic emotional connections mattered more than public opinion or political considerations. This was feminist assertion of personal autonomy at a time when British women's choices were heavily constrained by social expectations and family pressure. The fact that nearly 800 women married German prisoners in the immediate aftermath of the July 1947 policy change, with many more following in subsequent years, demonstrates that this was not an isolated phenomenon but represented hundreds of individual women making similar choices to prioritize personal relationships over political considerations. The long-term legacy of these marriages and the broader phenomenon of German prisoners working on British farms extends beyond the immediate participants to influence broader Anglo-German relations in the post-war period. The grassroots reconciliation that occurred on British farms, where former enemies worked together and sometimes formed families together, demonstrated that peace between nations could be built through individual human connections rather than only through diplomatic treaties and political agreements. The children born to these marriages, the former prisoners who remained in Britain as citizens, the British families who maintained friendships with Germans they had met during the war, all became living advocates for cooperation and mutual understanding that helped create psychological foundations for European integration in subsequent decades. When Germany joined the European Economic Community in 1958 as a founding member, and when Britain eventually joined in 1973 after initial hesitation, the political integration reflected decades of cultural and personal connections that had been building since the war's end. The former prisoners who had worked British farms, married British women, raised British children, and integrated into British communities were part of this foundation. They were personal embodiments of the possibility that former enemies could become partners, that national divisions could be transcended through individual human connection, that shared European identity could coexist with distinct national cultures. The marriages and families created through German prisoner deployment to British farms were not causes of European integration, but they were part of the broader pattern of post-war reconciliation that made integration possible. The story of German prisoners on British farms culminating in marriages challenges simplistic narratives about wartime and post-war period. It complicates pure victim/perpetrator dichotomies by showing that German soldiers were simultaneously perpetrators of aggressive war and individual young men capable of forming genuine human connections with those they had been taught to view as enemies. It challenges narratives of inevitable eternal enmity by demonstrating that even the deepest national divisions could be bridged through sustained human interaction and acts of courage from individuals willing to defy social pressure. It shows that women's agency and romantic choices could serve as forms of political resistance and bridges across national divides. It demonstrates that British civilians' choices to welcome former enemies into their homes and families represented moral courage that transcended understandable desires for revenge or, at minimum, continued separation. The photographs preserved in family albums across Britain show the human faces behind these statistics. Wedding photos of British brides and German grooms, often small ceremonies with few guests because of social controversy, but genuine smiles suggesting authentic happiness. Photos of young families with German fathers and British mothers holding children who represent reconciliation made flesh. Photos of former prisoners decades later visiting British farms where they had worked, elderly now but still recognizing the land they had tended as young captives. These images capture moments of personal triumph over historical tragedy, individual love overcoming collective hatred, hope for peaceful future built on foundation of personal connections rather than merely political agreements. For Klaus Hartmann, the young Oberstreiter who had stepped off the British Army lorry in April 1945 terrified of what awaited him, the journey from captured enemy to welcomed worker to British resident to husband and father represented transformation so complete that his younger self would have dismissed it as impossible fantasy. He worked the Thompson farm through 1945 and 1946, learning English from Mr. Thompson and his family, developing professional respect that gradually became genuine friendship, meeting Mr. Thompson's niece who visited the farm during harvest season in 1946, discovering through months of work alongside her that compatibility transcended nationality, falling in love despite language barriers and social pressure, proposing marriage in halting English in early 1947, waiting impatiently through months until the July policy change made marriage legal, marrying in small church ceremony in autumn 1947, transitioning from prisoner to civilian worker to eventually naturalized British citizen. Raising 3 children on a farm he eventually purchased from the Thompson family when Mr. Thompson retired, maintaining correspondence with family in Germany but building his life in Britain, dying in 1994 surrounded by British grandchildren who knew him only as the kind grandfather with the slight German accent who told wonderful stories about the old days. His story, multiplied across thousands of individual variations, represents the human dimension of historical statistics about German prisoners on British farms. Each of those 180,000 prisoners was an individual human being with story, personality, hopes, fears, and capacity for transformation through unexpected experiences. Each of the British families who worked alongside prisoners invited them to Christmas dinners, formed friendships or romantic relationships, faced choices about whether to respond with continued hostility or openness to connection. Each of the British women who married German prisoners made individual choices that required courage and resulted in families that bridged national divisions. The aggregate of these thousands of individual stories and choices created social transformation that influenced Anglo-German relations and European reconciliation in ways that official diplomacy alone could never achieve. The phenomenon of German prisoners working British farms culminating in marriages represents one of World War II's most remarkable and underappreciated stories. A narrative of enemies becoming workers, becoming friends, becoming family, of propaganda defeated by sustained human contact, of love triumphant over historical hatred, of courage demonstrated by ordinary people willing to defy social pressure to follow their hearts and consciences. It demonstrates that peace is built not only through treaties signed by diplomats, but through daily choices made by ordinary people to treat former enemies with humanity, to form connections across divisions, to prioritize individual relationships over collective hostilities. The children and grandchildren of those British-German marriages, living throughout Britain today, represent the enduring legacy of that reconciliation, living proof that even the deepest divides of the 20th century's most destructive conflict could be bridged through courage, love, and willingness to see the humanity in those we have been taught to hate.